this is a brief mention. A lot of the stuff that we read about dog-headed people is actually more believable than this. This part's a little weird because it's like the more consistent narrative is that a lot of these dog-headed people can't actually talk in human languages.
Yeah.
And that's part of the whole discussion for centuries is like, well, they can't talk, so they must be animals. Like, well, to be fair, it's not that they say they can't talk, it's that their speech is not human speech. So like a lot of them say that they speak by barking and that they have their own like dog language that they can't understand. And then others say that they use sign language to communicate, or both. This is one of the few, and there are a couple others, but this is one of the few where he claims that they could actually kind of talk in this discernible manner in a language that was close enough to something they could understand. There are more writings that discuss these wars against the Tartars and these dog-headed people. And this is why Martin put them exactly where he did on the map, because there were these writings about the Tartars, who basically at the time was like more or less what we now refer to as Mongols that had gone that far into Asia. They had taken over a lot. So they're in that region of Tartaria, and they're pushing back against the dog-headed people, and they're at these wars, and they're fighting over land as everybody does. And basically the dog-headed people end up in that region. So that's what he's basing his sources off of. Is that totally historically accurate? I have no idea. But that's what he did, and that's what those are the sources he was saying he was using. There are a couple others that we won't get into, but it's a wild map. It's really fun to look at, because what he depicts, and if you pay attention to the different depictions of the cynocephaly, some of them have their mouths closed and some of them have their mouths open. In this case, it shows in two different regions, dog-headed people with their mouths open and their tongue like wobbling. And that's supposed to symbolize the fact that they could speak.
Speaking.
Yeah.
Wow. So I assume the answer is no to this question. Okay. Because you said we're going to get weird. I'm like, okay, let's get weirder. But you're talking about the multilingual aspect of these things, where they use sign language, kind of speak for a human to understand.
Right.
And then barking, obviously, very fluent. First language.
Native tongue.
Yeah. I've talked to people who say they have communicated with these things. Mm-hmm. And there is a suggestion that there is a telepathic communication at times with these things. Mm-hmm. Have you ever come across anything like that in these writings where it suggests that these things are able to communicate without actually moving their mouths?
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned, what were the three things that you mentioned that you talked about in Utah? It was the
historical, manufactured, and metaphysical.
Yeah. So I have theories on all three of those.
Okay.
And the way that I understand this to be, and it's kind of funny, I know a lot of people who don't have the context for this is just going to sound absolutely insane. But this should click in your head, Tony. But having the understanding that these are highly likely descendants of Nephilim or Nephilim adjacent creations. This would mean that they are in fact demon brood to some extent, right? That they would have supernatural abilities. A lot of these writings, we'll get into some of them, at least one or two that talk about magic that they perform, because they're consistently understood to be, consistently is the wrong word, frequently understood to have magical abilities. So stuff like controlling ocean waves and forest magic and stuff like that. They're considered in South America from a lot of like oral traditions that they would be like kind of these spirit guides or have these spiritual aspects to them where they could vanish and very like honestly just demonic stuff, right? Where they would have these magical abilities. And in some of that stuff, yes, they would speak telepathically. But I really do think that's because of, if this is legitimate, then my biblical paradigm tells me that this would be through supernatural means that they're able to telepathically communicate with somebody else. Mm-hmm. And who knows, maybe that's where some of this confusion is, because, to be fair, it can be confusing. There's so many different sources, and you have to map it out and say, okay, well, these people are talking about these tribes in this location doing that, and these tribes in that location acting like this. And we'll talk about Marco Polo a little bit later, but he talks about, the ones that he saw looked like bull mastiff dogs, but the ones in Africa, they look more like jackals. And so there are variations. And, you know, when you talk about ones in Australia and certain islands, people are like, or, you know, South America, people are like, oh, well, they're cannibals. Maybe they were because they're cannibal people too, right? Again, they say, here's what's interesting, because they say cannibal, but they're not talking about eating each other.
They're talking about
eating humans. Yeah, they're talking about eating humans. And so they're like, oh yeah, they'll eat whoever they catch. And so you'll hear like, okay, well, this tribe seems to be these wise sages. And this tribe seems to be a very civilized. And this tribe, well, they seem to be cannibals and barbaric and all over the place. And so sometimes, you know, you can read these things and go, oh, well, you know, it's inconsistent. They don't know. How could we know what they really are? Because everyone's telling a different story. Actually, no. They're telling consistent stories to certain locations.
Yeah.
And those different tribes just have very different, they're like us. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's like, they're different tribes of humanity. We do different things. We look different. We act different. We have different practices. You know, we do magic. You know, let's acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And I mean, let's just, I mean, put it in a perspective of, I mean, imagine if, you know, just we're not going down this topic, but say millions of light years away, there are aliens that exist